The Cenepa War, also known as the Alto Cenepa War, was a brief and localized military conflict between Ecuador and Peru, fought over control of an area in Peruvian territory near the border between the two countries. The two nations had signed a border treaty following the Ecuadorian-Peruvian War of 1941. But Ecuador later disagreed with the treaty as it applied to the Cenepa and Paquisha areas, and in 1960 Ecuador declared the treaty null and void. Mediation efforts of Argentina, Brazil, Chile and the United States paved the way for the opening of diplomatic conversations that ultimately led to the signing of a definitive peace agreement on the 26th of October 1998. The peace agreement was followed by the formal demarcation of the border on the 13th of May 1999 and the end of the multinational MOMEP troop deployment on the 17th of June 1999, which effectively put an end to one of the longest territorial disputes in the Western Hemisphere. Background: the Cenepa War was the most recent military clash between Ecuador and Peru over a long-standing territorial dispute that dated back to the first decades of the 19th century, when both countries came into being after the wars of independence of the Spanish colonies in South America. In modern times there had been two previous military confrontations, a full-scale war in 1941, and a brief clash in 1981, both of which had seen the Peruvian military forces prevailing over the Ecuadorian military. Overview: most of the fighting of the Cenepa War was centered around the control of several outposts located on the headwaters of the Cenepa River, a highland area covered with dense Amazonian jungle, inside a 78 kilometers long strip of territory where the process of demarcation between Ecuador and Peru remained stalled since 1951. One of the outposts causing the dispute, called T-Windsor by the Ecuadorians and T-Windsor by the Peruvians, came to symbolize the war because of the bitter clashes that took place around it, and the emotional importance that both sides attached to its possession. The conflict continued until the signing of a ceasefire and the eventual separation of forces, supervised by the MOMEP, a multinational mission of military observers from the guarantor countries of the 1942 Rio Protocol, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the USA. The Cenepa War ended up producing far-reaching consequences for relations between Ecuador and Peru. The military outcome of the brief conflict, vindicating the Ecuadorian armed forces after the disappointing results of the War of 1941, and by calling to the attention of the Peruvians the need for a resolution of a problem, paved the way for a definitive settlement of the border issues. Thus, in the aftermath of the war, both nations, brokered by the guarantors of the Rio Protocol, entered into a long and difficult negotiation process that concluded with the signing of a peace treaty in 1998, and the closing of the hitherto undemarcated stretch of common border, deep in the Amazonian rainforest. Disputed border. Following the Ecuadorian-Peruvian War of 1941, both countries had signed in 1942 a peace treaty known as the Rio Protocol. This treaty, brokered by the USA, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, which became known as the guarantors of the peace settlement, had the main purpose of defining the hitherto badly defined borders between Ecuador and Peru. The process of demarcation, begun in mid-1942, came to a halt in 1948, when populist Ecuadorian President José María Velasco Ibarra declared the protocol impossible to implement in the area of the Cordillera del Condor. claiming inconsistencies between the instructions of the protocol and the geographical realities on the ground. Peru contested this view, stating that such discrepancies had already been solved in an arbitration that had taken place in 1945, and that all that had to be done was to close the border following the guidelines of the protocol and the ruling of the 1945 arbitration. By the beginning of the 1950s, the situation had come to a deadlock. For the next 46 years, a 78 kilometers long strip of mostly unpopulated and little explored territory, deep in the Amazonian rainforest and almost inaccessible by land, was left undemarcated, serving as a flashpoint for recurrent diplomatic and military crisis between Ecuador and Peru. While Peru held to the view that the border in the undemarcated area ran along the heights of the Condor Range, Ecuador insisted that there was no technical basis for considering that mountain range as the border between the two nations, hinting at the idea that the spirit of the protocol, which had never mentioned the Condor Range by name, would require the location of the border markers along the Cenepa River, immediately to the east of the range. The Ecuadorian stance had a symbolic meaning of its own. The Cenepa River was a small tributary of the Marañón River, in turn a tributary of the Amazon River, to which Ecuador had always claimed the right for a sovereign access. Events leading up to the war, just as in the Paquisha incident of 1981, the Cenepa War was caused by the installation by Ecuador, since 1994, of border outposts on the Cenepa River basin in eastern Cordillera del Condor, with the names of Quevedo Los Deos, Baysur and Windsor. Tensions along the Condor Range had been running high following a crisis that arose in July 1991 over the location of a Peruvian outpost called Pachacatec, inside a zone that, while 60 kilometers north of the delimited and undemarcated area, had its own problems regarding the location of a single border marker. Ecuador had protested over the location of Pachacatec, since it was, according to Ecuador, inside Ecuadorian territory, and went on to set up an outpost of its own right in front of it. For Peru, there was no question that both Pachacatec and Etsa were inside Peruvian territory, although the crisis was diffused the following month with the signing of a Pacto de Caballeros, by which both sides committed themselves to abandon these posts and separate the forces. The aftermath of the incident saw both countries accusing each other of violating the accord and reinforcing the military presence in the delimited and undemarcated area. New crisis. Still, for the next 3 years, tensions were kept at manageable levels. Apart from the uneasy encounters between rival patrols, which sometimes included brief exchanges of fire, most commonly every January, no serious incidents happened. Then, at the end of 1994, a new crisis suddenly erupted, this time in the undemarcated border area proper, around the Condor Range and the Cenepa headwaters, Baysur, and a meeting of colonels. Peruvian accounts state that in November 1994, a Peruvian patrol, advancing through the Cenepa headwaters, was intercepted by an Ecuadorian patrol. Being told they had crossed into Ecuadorian territory, the Peruvians were escorted to the Ecuadorian outpost of Baysur, where the patrol was given supplies before continuing their journey. Afterwards, realizing Baysur was actually in Peruvian claimed territory, the Peruvians asked the Ecuadorians for a meeting of superior officers. The meeting, which the Peruvians date to December 20th and the Ecuadorians to December 12th, took place in Baysur, between the commanders of the opposing battalions in the area. According to Ecuadorian accounts, During the meeting, the Peruvian officer called to the attention of his Ecuadorian counterpart that the presence of Ecuadorian outposts in the headwaters of the Cenepa River constituted a violation of Peruvian territory, and that therefore the posts had to be abandoned and the troops moved back to the line of the Condor Range. The Ecuadorian account of the meeting also states that the Peruvian officer went on to deliver an ultimatum: if the Ecuadorians did not abandon the area by the end of the week, the Peruvians would dislodge them by force. After the meeting, if not before it, both Quito and Lima began to send reinforcements to the area, while further meetings between superior officers didn't manage to break the deadlock, apparently unable to reach a compromise solution. In retrospect, it could be said that the Cenepa War had the same causes that brought about the Paquisha incident of 1981, that is, the Peruvian discovery of Ecuadorian outposts on the eastern slopes of the Condor Range, and below in the Cenepa Valley, followed by the decision to dislodge the Ecuadorians from these locations by force. The Ecuadorian army, evidently bent on preventing any repetition of the Pachacatec incident, and to forestall any Peruvian attempt to reach the crests of the Condor Range, had gone on to establish a defensive perimeter on the area of Cenepa Valley, with two outposts, T. Windsor and Bay Sur, on the Cenepa headwaters, and a larger outpost, Coangos, on the high ground overlooking them from the north. In turn, the guarantors military considered both Ecuadorian and Peruvian moves as offensive in character, due to the fact that, lacking official border markers, the Ecuadorian and Peruvian military had long since agreed to consider the line of the Condor Range a de facto border, already considered broken by both countries since 1981. Mobilizing for war. During the second half of December, both sides began to hastily reinforce the military presence in and around the Cenepa Valley area, laying down new minefields, preparing supply bases, and intensifying the patrolling activity. By the end of December, profiting from its internal lines of communications, the Ecuadorian army had strengthened to a considerable degree its presence in the area, having deployed a number of units, foremost among them several special forces formations, as well as artillery and BM-21 multiple rocket launches on the heights of the Cordillera del Condor. The entire Ecuadorian perimeter was covered by anti-aircraft batteries and, most significantly, several teams carrying Soviet-made SAR-16 IGLA and British-made blowpipe-manned portable surface-to-air missiles. Meanwhile, the Ecuadorian Air Force was frantically getting up to operational status its fleet of subsonic and supersonic jet aircraft, and adapting existing airfields in southeastern Ecuador to function as forward deployment bases for the Ecuadorian military, especially the Army and Air Force. The memories of the conflict of 1981 and its embarrassing outcome were still fresh. The lessons learned, and every measure was taken to avoid a similar outcome if and when the threat of war became a reality. For the Peruvian military, the mobilization process was somewhat more problematic. The Cenepa Valley area was devoid of any major roads, population centers, or helicopter bases on the Peruvian side. The Peruvian Army and the Peruvian Air Force had to organize an air bridge to get reinforcements to the zone. Troops, heavy weapons, ammunition and supplies had to be flown in first from the Peruvian hinterland and Lima to Bagua AFB, where they were transferred to light transport aircraft for the flight to the Cerro Alegria base. For this base, the final flight to the Peruvian forward bases in the Cenepa Valley, mainly Observation Post 1, was made aboard Peru's MOMEP 8 and MOMEP 17 helicopter fleet. heat, very often under poor weather conditions, with heavy rain and low cloud cover. Altogether, by the third week of January, both Peru and Ecuador had managed to deploy around 5,000 troops to the immediate vicinity of the delimited and undemarcated area. First encounters with the coming of the New Year crisis loomed in the Cenepa Valley. By January 8, the Peruvian army had deployed 4 patrols near Base Sur. On the night of January 9, 1995, Ecuadorian troops found and captured 4 Peruvian soldiers that, according to the Ecuadorian accounts, were supposedly reconnoitering the approaches to the Ecuadorian outpost of Cueva de los Deos, following the customary regulations put in place by both armies for the handling of such instances, the so-called cartiles de seguridad y confianza. The captured Peruvian personnel were delivered to their own officers without further incident. Always following the Ecuadorian accounts, a subsequent incident took place 2 days later, on January 11, when another Peruvian patrol was detected near a place called the Y, a point of tactical importance in the Ecuadorian lines. Shots were fired, apparently causing no casualties on either side. Open war. By the third week of January, the Peruvian High Command had deployed to the Cenepa area what it considered to be enough troops to clear any and all Ecuadorian troops on the eastern side of the Cordillera del Condor. In retrospect, it is likely that Lima was expecting a repetition of the 1981 incident, unaware of the scale of the Ecuadorian deployment. Thus, as a preliminary to the attack, on January 21, Peruvian helicopters began a series of reconnaissance and troop insertion flights on the rear of the Ecuadorian positions, which continued for the next 2 days. The next day, January 22, the Ecuadorians detected around 20 Peruvian troops setting up a heliport to the north and rear of the Ecuadorian forward outposts. The stepping up of the Peruvian air operations, combined with the surprise discovery of a Peruvian base on the rear of the Ecuadorian perimeter, compelled the Ecuadorian High Command to take the initiative. That same day, a reinforced Special Forces company was ordered to advance undetected through the dense jungle and dislodge the Peruvians from the site, named by the Ecuadorians Base Norte. Significantly, the decision to act was made by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army before informing the President of the Republic, Sixto Duran Balen, and his National Security Council. The Ecuadorian High Command had by then interpreted the failure of the Commander-in-Chief of the Peruvian Armed Forces, General Nicolas de Barrejomosa, to respond to calls from his Ecuadorian counterpart as a signal that the Peruvian military, with or without the knowledge of Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori, was preparing a military operation in the Cenepa Valley. The next day, the decision to act already taken, the Ecuadorian local commander informed his Peruvian counterpart that, from January 24 onwards, any Peruvian helicopter flying over Ecuadorian positions would be shot down. On the morning of Thursday, January 26, 1995, after 3 days of march, the Ecuadorian Special Forces detachment arrived undetected at the small Peruvian outpost Base Norte and launched a surprise attack on the unsuspecting garrison. A fierce firefight ensued, but the Peruvians were eventually forced to disperse through the jungle, leaving behind a number of dead soldiers, as well as weapons and supplies. The Cenepa War had begun. Chronology of the war. The following days, the events unfolded in quick succession. Below is a complete chronological summary of the war. January 24, Peru mobilizes troops towards Windsor. Ecuador engages in preparing the Ecuadorian fighter jets. January 25, Peru militarizes a site in the Condor Strip later known as Base Sur, thus provoking reaction by Ecuador. Ecuadorian forces, initiating the war. January 26, Peruvian conscripts setting up a heliport in quebrada fashion, behind the Ecuadorian outposts built in Peru's land since 1994, are attacked by Ecuadorian special forces, dislodging the Peruvians from the site. The Ecuadorians named the place Base Norte. Thus begins the shooting war. January 27, Ecuador and Peru order general mobilization. Armored units are deployed to the Pacific coast border area, ready to act in case of a general war. Altogether, around 140,000 men were mobilized during the war. January 28, at 7:45, the Peruvians launched the first ground assault against the Ecuadorian positions in the Cenepa headwaters. The attack is renewed at 11:05, this time with helicopters providing suppressive fire. At 9 o'clock, a Peruvian Air Force Bell 212 helicopter was damaged in its fuel tank by Ecuadorian fire. At 12:05, Peruvian ground attack aircraft make the first appearance over the valley, but withdraw upon being informed of the presence of fire interceptors in the area. January 29, in a pattern that will continue during the next days, Peruvian forces launch multiple and simultaneous attacks all over the area, in an effort to off-balance the Ecuadorian defenses. The Ecuadorians fight back at Windsor, Quebrada Los Deos, Base Sur, and Coangos, and shoot down a Soviet-made Mi-8 TV helicopter belonging to the Peruvian Army. Aviation becomes the first confirmed kill for the Ecuadorian MOMEP teams on the ground. At the end of the day, Peru announces having captured 3 Ecuadorian strongholds as a result of the day's actions, which Ecuador goes on to deny. January 31, after a 24-hour lull in the fight, the Peruvians resumed their attacks against Windsor, Coangos, and Quebrada Los Deos. Ecuador and Peru reject an international appeal for an immediate ceasefire. February 1, the assaults continue, now with strong artillery support. Peruvian A-37B ground attack aircraft appear over the battlefield and bomb Ecuadorian positions. The Ecuadorian base of Condor Mirador, in the summit of the Cordillera del Condor, falls also under attack. A Peruvian patrol approaching Quebrada Los Deos hits a minefield and suffers severe losses. February 2. During the day, the FAP carries out no less than 12 ground attack sorties, in support of the ground troops assaulting Quebrada Los Deos and Base Sur. Fire interceptors, still flying from bases too far north near Guayaquil, appear too late to find any targets. February 3. Ecuadorian strike masters and A-37B ground attack aircraft appear for the first time to bomb Peruvian positions. February 4. Peruvian Tucanos bomb Ecuadorian positions in the valley during a night bombing sortie. February 6. The FAP begins to make use of its Canberra jet bombers to strike Ecuadorian positions. One Canberra is lost, perhaps crashed into a mountain due to the bad weather conditions over the area. February 7. In a bitter reminder of the dangers that the Cenepa Valley pose for low-speed aircraft flying at low altitudes, a FAP Mi-25 helicopter gunship is downed after being hit in quick succession by at least 2 SAR-16's shoulder-fired missiles. 5 A-37Bs, escorted by KFIR fighters, continue to attack Peruvian positions. One A-37B is hit by Peruvian AA fire, but manages to get back to base. February 9. Heavy air activity. The FAP carries out no less than 16 ground attack sorties, throwing its fleet of Sukhoi Su-22 fighter bombers into the battle. FAP Canberras carry out a night bombing mission. February 10. Heavy air activity continues over the battle zone. During the morning, the FAP sends in A-37Bs and Sukhoi Su-22 to strike Ecuadorian positions. The FI steps in. At 12:42, the Ecuadorian radars pick up 5 enemy targets approaching for another round of attacks. 2 FI Mirage F1 JAS and 2 IIKFIRC, 2s are sent to intercept the incoming aircraft. In the ensuing action, an A-37B subsonic aircraft is shot down by KFIR and 2 Peruvian Sukhoi Su-22s were claimed to be shot down by the Ecuadorian Mirage F1 respectively. Peru, however, denied that the 2 Sukhoi Su-22s were shot down by Mirages, stating that one was struck by Ecuadorian anti-aircraft artillery during a low-flying ground attack mission, and the second because of an engine fire. February 11, further Peruvian Special Forces reinforcements arrive at PV-1. As the ground war drags on, air activity over the area increases. Encouraged by the events of the day before, the Ecuadorian A-37Bs launch even bolder ground attack missions on Peruvian positions. One FI A-37B is hit by a Peruvian MANPAD, but the crew manages to fly it back to base. February 12, air operations continue. The Peruvians claim the destruction of one A-37B and one KFIR, both of them denied by Ecuador. February 13, Peruvian forces launch powerful attacks against Coangos and Windsor, with heavy air support. One Peruvian Mi-8TV is lost to Ecuadorian fire. In the evening, Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori appears before the cameras to claim the taking of Windsor and total victory for Peru. However, the Ecuadorians denied this claim by showing the position of Windsor by GPS, but their coordinates were false. February 14 to 16, combat continues all along the area. February 17, in the presence of the 4 guarantor countries of the Rio Protocol, Ecuadorian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcelo Fernández de Córdoba, and Peruvian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Eduardo Ponce, sign a peace declaration in Brazil, confirming a ceasefire, a separation of forces, a general demobilization, and establishing a guarantors peacekeeping force, the MOMEP, charged with supervising the separation of forces, taking over the posts of Windsor and Base Sur, and suggesting the limits for an eventual demilitarized zone. Ecuador and Peru pledged themselves to begin talks on the pending issues. February 21, the first MOMEP observers arrived to the Ecuadorian rear base of Partuca, but confused fighting rages on all day long, preventing the observers to reach the area of the conflict. Ecuador claims Peruvian helicopters are violating the ceasefire by flying over the Ecuadorian posts. February 22, in a day that Ecuadorians refer to as Black Wednesday, Peruvian forces launch a strong attack on Ecuadorian positions in Cenepa Valley. According to Ecuadorian sources, 14 of the soldiers died that day, the worst in terms of casualties for the Ecuadorian army during the war. That afternoon and night, the Ecuadorian forces retaliate against Peruvians' positions until the next day, when was detected an intense activity in the Peruvian lines. Identified by the Ecuadorian officers is the evacuation of the casualties caused by the offensive the night before. February 28, after more days of confusing skirmishes, Ecuador and Peru sign the Montevideo Declaration, reiterating the commitment to proceed to an immediate and effective ceasefire. Although minor incidents would continue all over the area during the next months, the Cenepa War is officially over.